Good evening. I'm Dr. Vincent Bacote. I am the director of the Wheaton College Center for Applied Christian Ethics. Each year, the Center for Applied Christian Ethics has an annual theme. This year, the theme has been about the word evangelical and the evangelical movement. And for our final event of the year, we've decided to have a panel about rehabilitating the word evangelical, or at least talking about rehabilitating the word evangelical, because the language I've been using recently is that it's at least one metaphor for the current state of affairs has been that if evangelicalism, or the word evangelical, is like a cruise ship, it's been hit by a torpedo. And of course, you know, people have different views of what the torpedo is, but it's important to talk about, okay, if it's been hit by this torpedo, do you try to keep this afloat or do you just let it sink? Because some people have certainly taken that position in relationship to the word and to the movement itself. So we're going to have a conversation here for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll invite you to come up and have questions. Now, it's important to say, before I introduce our panelists, that questions, a comment briefly before a question is okay. A discourse is unhelpful. So please make questions actual questions so that the panelists can respond, and then if there's a follow-up, then that's fine. But getting to the question first will be significantly, greatly appreciated in advance. So just going down the line here, to my left is our provost, Dr. Margaret Diddams, who's not just the provost, but also an industrial organizational psychologist, and that's where the vantage point that she's coming from this evening. To her left is Dr. Timothy Larson, my colleague in the Bible and Theology Department, who is a historian and theologian. To his left is Dr. Ruth Padilla, DeBorst, who is visiting with us. And if you were looking at the slides, you also see that this is sort of the first of her public events, because there's another public event where she's giving a lecture with Human Needs and Global Resources tomorrow night. So she is a multidisciplinary person with expertise in Bible theology and missiology. To her left is Dr. Bryan McGraw, a political philosopher and now Dean of the Social Sciences. Is that yes? Correct. Is that the correct? Yes. Yes. Yep. Delightful. Well, I'm thankful for their participation. I'm thankful for your attendance with us this evening. So sometimes when you have these kinds of events and it's about rehabilitating something, you just go negative from the start. I'm going to flip the script on that and start with a positive question that will first go to Dr. Larson, given the fact that he's written about the history of evangelicalism. And then each panelist will also respond to this for a couple of minutes, and this will kick off our conversation. And so here's the question, which is, what are one or two positive dimensions of the evangelical movement or of the word evangelical itself?
So a word that's not very good is Anglican. Have you noticed that? Episcopalian, not a good word. Lutheran, no. Methodist, sorry, no. Presbyterian, no. Not good words. Catholic's a good word. Orthodox is a pretty good word. Baptist is a pretty good word. Pentecostal is a pretty good word. But evangelical is better than all those. If you got to stand for something, stand for the gospel. It's a wonderful word, and it forces everybody to go back to it eventually. I did exchange with a guy who sent me hate mail. I always, try a soft answer turns away wrath, so I replied to them all, and he actually took the bait. We got into a long conversation. And of course, it was like 9 swaps in before he finally broke down and said, "So what is an evangelical anyway?" So evangelical is a beautiful word because it points us back to the gospel, and that's worth standing for. And it also, since we get to, connects us with many beautiful Christians across the globe, across the centuries, across the denominations who have lived faithful and worthy lives. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Benedicta Ramabai, William Wilberforce, Josephine Butler. There is a long, impressive cloud of witnesses that the Word connects us to, and those are things to celebrate.
Thank you. Dr. Diddams?
Well, I am now finding out that I'm history because I am remembering things that students are now writing about. And so I want to talk about this a little bit in a frame of evangelical history. I grew up in a tradition that was very much an inclusive type of the world is now evil, and except for saving souls, there was really no need to engage. And in fact, that was the only reason to engage. When I came here to Wheaton College to visit in 1978, I saw men and women holding hands, and I thought, this isn't really a Christian school. that was kind of the, but I knew the professors were, but I didn't think the students necessarily were, since they were holding hands. That just give you the idea of my background. So fast forward to my sophomore year, it's September 1980. It's a lovely Sunday afternoon, and it is the dedication of this building with Billy Graham speaking on the purposes of the building, and then Charles Malik, who was the Lebanese ambassador to the U.S., talking about the two tasks of the Christian: to be both faithful to the gospel and to engage the world. And that night, I realized what it was to be an evangelical, in that we own the importance of engagement. And it's not just engagement to share the gospel, as important as that is, and engagement with the scripture, as important as that is, but is a recognition of all of God's creation in a world that is redeemed and not yet perfected, and we are called to act in that redemption in an engaging way. And I am so still struck by that night, 40 years ago almost now, that I absolutely hold on to the word evangelical.
Thank you. Dr. Padilla, DeBorst?
So I come from a slightly different place in the world. And I'm just going to start with a little story, because when my husband was courting me, he lived in El Salvador, I lived in Argentina. And one of his hesitations in our relationship was that maybe I was too evangelical. So we had to parse out, what does this mean? And he said, well, you went to Wheaton College, to graduate school, and you've been active in IFES, International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, and INFIMIT, at that time, International Fellowship of Evangelical Mission Theologians, evangelical all over the place. And so I'm saying, well, what's the problem? And for him, living in Central America, where evangelicalism meant these mega prosperity gospel churches copying those from North America, evangelical meant alienated from society, nothing to do with the issues of the context, just waiting for heaven to escape the world. So we had to work out precisely what you just mentioned, the fact that it is engagement with a vision of God's purposes for the world, but it also is engagement with the world that God so loves. And so parsing that out and understanding then, and recognizing that actually evangelical in Latin America and in much of the world has been equal to Protestant. It's non-Christian, non-Catholic Christians are all evangelical.
Thank you. Dr. McGraw?
So I guess in some sense I have the hardest task, since I think part of a significant portion of the reason that people are disenchanted with the term evangelical is politics. And so let me suggest, though, that there's actually something, many sort of good things to say about evangelical, even evangelical politics over the past, say, half century or so. There's a myth that up until the religious right showed up in the late 70s, early 80s, that evangelicals had been kind of disenchanted from politics and not really engaged in politics and had withdrawn and such. And there's some truth to it. I mean, it's not entirely a myth, but it's kind of mythological. Evangelicals had always been in politics. They voted like other citizens, and they were in city offices and, and whatnot. But they sort of began to function in politics as evangelicals, and at least rhetorically, and I think in some degree substantively, attempted to bring their faith to bear on politics. And so I think actually one of the things that we should celebrate, even if in some weird, ironic way it has probably sort of turned on itself and had some negative consequences, is the fact that here was a group of people who are very committed to engaging politics as a moral enterprise, as something to do something more than just who gets what. There's a great temptation in politics to be what, say, a Machiavelli or a Weber said it was. It's just kind of this sort of collection and disbursement of resources, friend-enemy distinctions. But evangelicalism, even as a political movement, has at least, for the most part, attempted to kind of do something more, advance a vision of what a good society looks like, bring moral claims to bear. Sometimes that's very controversial. Sometimes it's been done very, very badly. But that's something to be appreciated, and something that if we cast off, I think we might really neglect or regret.
Okay, thank you. Of course, since you did bring it up, Dr. McGraw, we'll just come right back to you. And then we can come back down the line this way, or if someone wants to interject something in terms of your response, that's also all right. What are a couple of things that are the key factors that have made the crisis?
Yeah.
In terms of, because if people say it's politics, that's still not telling us. But what about politics?
Right. Well, I mean, we could just spend the rest of and we probably will spend much of the rest of the night talking about this. But I think one way to frame it is thinking of it as too much politics and too little. Too much politics in the sense that politics and political success, the campaigning, the canvassing, the sort of attention to political issues has become too central to kind of evangelical identity, right? And this seems very clear where you look at surveys of self-described evangelicals, and it's quite clear that their partisan identities matter more than their religious identities in sort of determining how they vote, how they think about politics. So politics becomes too much. But also it's a little too little in the sense that it's too thin. It's too focused on certain particular issues. It's only worried about winning particular elections or getting a seat in the Supreme Court or a couple little kind of things, and not really conceived of being engaged in politics with the full swath of issues and the full kind of range of activities. Not recognizing that most of politics is not what goes on talk shows or on radio, but happens at boring meetings in windowless rooms where you're hammering out some kind of committee response to things. That's what most of politics is, and we've kind of, I think, in many ways lost sight of that. And so too much and too little, I would say. I mean, there's a lot more to say, but that's kind of where I would start.
Thanks.
Well, a suspicion I have is that those of us that know the language of heaven, Spanish, obviously, and the Romance languages, we have an advantage in that evangelico or evangelica is so much closer to evangelio, gospel, right? Where when you split these, evangelical and gospel, then you're susceptible to all kinds of other agendas. When evangelico and evangelio are closer, then you are much more tuned in to the fact that this is the good news. This is the good news that Jesus announced, that Jesus lived out, that that he called us to live into, and that has to do with all dimensions of life. And so it's not an issue just of how we manage power, and power and politics are in all levels of society and all our human relationships, not just in electoral issues, but in the way we manage our homes, in the way we deal with our neighbors, in the way we manage an educational institution. There's politics in all of that. But so the good news then questions who we exercise power for, how we exercise power, in what way we're living into the reign of God and not ours. So anyway, I just think that we have, in a way, language matters and marks our imagination to a point where there's more work to be done to kind of recover, reclaim the term evangelical, maybe in English even, than there is in some of our other languages.
Oh, thank you.
I've been thinking lately how everything my youth pastor told me the modern world would be like is wrong. And I heard, that speech just went for decades. It was supposed to be all about relativism and tolerance and apathy. We live in a deeply self-righteous age that's highly moralistic and judgmental and intolerant and sectarian and tribal. All the opposites of what I was told was supposed to be happening. And I think we're part of that. So this is not answering everything, but it's a piece of it, which is just that evangelical, by just being a word that denominates a particular group of people, allows people who don't self-denominate that way to find it as a target for here's something that I hate. It's the other from me. And again, I think that's happening in our culture with lots of things, but people want to self-identify in a deeply self-righteous way with something and to demonize other groups. And evangelical is functioning that way for some people, not everyone, but for some people. It's a group that is a shorthand for my self-identity is fostered by hating and despising another group. But that's innumerable labels in our society that is now happening but we're part of that phenomenon.
So I just want to add again, being living history, if we go back 20, 30 years and we think about the notion of power, there's multiple ways that power plays out in society, and politics is one of them. We can think about global national finance, we can think about arts, we can think about education. Those are all centers of power. We go back to the 80s and 90s, Christian evangelicals are either a second thought or are held in suspicion even then. So the only place that we see evangelicals come into power in those three areas is in politics. And you might want to talk to that historian or politician. But I just want to give you an example. I had the privilege very early in my career to teach at Columbia University in New York. And of course I have Wheaton College brightly there on my CV. And the director, the dean of the program in organizational psychology at Columbia says, "I see you went to Wheaton College," with a little turn up in his voice. And I said, "Yeah, well, I went in Baptist and came out Presbyterian." That was it. And I thought, well, years later, I thought that's fairly true given our Reformed orientation on most days. But the point being is that we can talk about this as a current crisis, and it may be acute, but evangelicalism has always brushed up against power in ways that all of us have had to navigate in different ways. I just think it's more acute now.
So one of the public accusations, because it is a cottage industry in recent years to decode what evangelicalism is really about, right? I mean, it's a great way to, get lots of retweets or perhaps even the occasional appearance on some talk show. So people were saying that they're saying that, there's just a enthusiasm about access to power, and they mean certain people, but those certain people are really proxy for largely, white evangelicals vote Republican, right? in what sense is that true, or in what sense is that overblown? Because I mean, like, you know, both Ruth and Margaret, you noted that you know, politics and power are in all kinds of places, right? But it's largely this political power piece that is one of the things that people are saying is, you know, if you really want to know what's going on, power seeking or loving finally getting the access, finally being the insider. So how true is that as part of what the problem is, and how much of that is really a convenient explanation in light of the current state of affairs and certain people that get microphones a lot?
I mean, are you asking whether there's a sense in which evangelicals have been willing to betray their ideals, betray their core beliefs in return for power or access to power? That's more precise?
That is one of
Yeah.
the reasons. Some it has less to do with even just the willingness to betray. It's just liking being close.
Yeah.
And finally, you know, we're in the proverbial smoke-filled room, though of course that's the tension for evangelical identity, of course, that term. But proverbially speaking.
Evangelicals vape.
Yeah. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. But that's that. I mean, it's not necessarily that there's the trade-off. That is one of the explanations. But sometimes the hot take is it's just it's like a drug, and you really like it now that you got it.
Well, I guess we are talking about a lot of politics, aren't we? For some people, sure, right? For some people, you know, I remember being at a dinner with a gentleman who's well-known in sort of conservative evangelical politics, and asking him, and he related that he became a Christian in college. And I said, "Oh, how did your politics change?" "Well, no, nothing. Nothing changed at all." I mean, nothing, literally, he said. And then I said, "So what, I mean, but you're known as doing, you know, Christian politics." He says, "Well, yeah, you know." And he didn't say it, but I sort of think that the unspoken sentence was, it's kind of useful. It's a way of mobilizing people, right? And this is what political elites do all the time, right? They find sort of means of identity, or they find sort of issues, or they find sort of mechanisms for grouping people together over against other people to win elections, to gain support, to do whatever it is you happen to be doing. So to some degree, sure, that's probably true. But I don't think it's necessarily any more true than any other kind of social movement out there, where people mobilize environmental claims, they mobilize racial and ethnic identities, they mobilize class identities, mobilize all these kinds of things as a means of kind of getting power, and maybe they have some moral, ideological commitments that they're kind of trying to put into play. Maybe they don't. Maybe it's just a convenient place that's where they happen to end up. I mean, it's very hard to know those things. But in all those cases, those things only work to the degree that the people that they're mobilizing or grouping together it actually connects something to them, right? It doesn't actually work unless there's like, oh yeah, I kind of recognize that, and that seems to make sense to me. So I think it would be much too broad a brush to sort of suggest that particularly kind of like political evangelicalism over the last, say, 40, 50 years has been motivated simply by power, or sort of leveraged into place by people who just simply want power. But it wouldn't exclude the fact that there are people who have done that. I mean, that seems to be very clear.
I'm struck by your point, finally, when the general assumption, at least looking at this country from the outside, has been that Protestant evangelicalism in some form or other has been pretty much in the good standing of society, and had leverage and had space, and there's kind of the assumption that it is a Christian nation, and Christian in a kind of Protestant evangelical mode of Christianity, versus a place like Latin America that's been predominantly Roman Catholic, and Protestant evangelicalism has been the minority and had to find ways to be legitimately and to have space and to have a voice in society. And so it strikes me when you say finally, when from the
Yeah,
outside
sure,
it looks
sure.
like actually it seems,
great, yeah.
and it reminds me of, Mark Laberton edited this book recently, right? Still Evangelical, question mark. And in his introduction, he says, maybe the question really is yet evangelical? Have we ever really thoroughly been evangelical in this country, or has it been that just kind of Christendom model of an allegiance of power and faith that is not necessarily the good news of Jesus Christ and of God's reign?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because if you think about the phrase white Anglo-Saxon Protestant,
Right.
Yeah.
right, okay, which is your mainline denominations, people on the main line, a rather well-to-do area near Philadelphia, and Ivy League schools being basically WASP finishing schools, right, to sort of keep that in place. And then varying ways in which contemporary evangelicalism has arguably been at odds with that, either by withdrawing or by losing fundamentalist modernist controversy. I mean, that's one of the narratives, right? But it does raise the question about, well, are you upset because you don't have either the cultural influence that you had, or the foundations of the culture that are keeping things going in a particular way, so that it's a kind of Christian nation, and then trying to get back the power to have that level of influence. It's just interesting to think about it from that regard, because certainly part of the public narrative of evangelicals since arguably the 70s, let's say, is this idea of getting back influence,
Covering.
right? Of having lost it. It's like you were about to say
I
something.
wasn't, but come on, you want to?
Oh, sure. Mark.
Well, I think this is, now I get to be an industrial organizational psychologist, is one of the things that I think is, his first question here is, what are some of the key factors that have led to this current crisis?
Yes.
So that makes the assumption that's a crisis, but we won't go there. But what are the key factors that maybe have led up to this? And I would say one of the things we have seen with the rise of social media is the clanism, right? I can now read the feeds I want to read. I can follow the news I want to follow. I can basically focus on the people in my in-group, which then makes my in-group smaller and the out-group a whole lot larger. And because of that, not because of, and in relation to, there is less willingness to engage institutions, right? Because I don't really need an institution. I have my feeds. And when we think of Wheaton College, for example, I've always thought of Wheaton College as an institution, and sociologically, that is an organization that people look to for morals, for norms, for ways of engaging, for behavior. What I think is happening in our country, at least, with the rise of this kind of individualism and tight in-grouping, is people are less reliant and less trustful of institutions, because what shows up in the feed is all the negative things, right? So how many times since I've come back in the last 3 years is reading negative and almost made up things about Wheaton College. And it's just, for me, it's a way to whack the institution, because you can get more, I think institutions in the US are being reduced to clickbaits. And so we have to be even a stronger voice into our mission so that we are more than clickbait. So your question number 5 in this conversation, how does a place like Wheaton help to carve out a better path for a better evangelicalism? I think it is doing what we do at a level that is more intense and intentional, with the excellence that we always bring to things. So let me give example of, we have 8 centers, right? As of yesterday, we added a center for faith and innovation. But if we think about what these centers do, there's 5 things. They convene experts. So who is of like minds to think, to generate what is the current thought? We are evangelical voice to the church. So how do we think about power within evangelicalism? We're an integrative resource for students. So how do students engage the liberal arts? And our centers do a great job in that integrative aspect. We're knowledge generators. So I see our Wade Center director right in front of us. We generate knowledge as an evangelical institution. And then we bring the world to Wheaton. Our centers are so important for being an evangelical voice that cuts above the noise and the clickbait. And I believe, as your provost, we need to be investing in these areas so that we continue to be an institution for those who are looking for more than clickbaits and easy answers and the outrage that we see all around us.
So following up on that,
Can I get an amen?
I happened to be reading an email that we received in relationship to our conversation that we're having tonight. I mean, in part, you've begun to answer that question, but I'm interested in hearing our other panelists answer this. It was basically, well, good luck with that conversation tonight, because it's a lost cause, the label, the name, right? So what do we do when we have people who are perhaps institutionally cynical about institutions, and thinking, look, let's just do something else and just politely or not so politely put the term and the movement out to pasture?
So I have mixed thoughts on that. On one side, there's nothing more evangelical than ditching a term if it's not working. Let me just say, Wellspring, Compass, One Line, churches are rebranded across this region so fast in the last 5 or 6 years. That's what evangelicals do. They try to be something that's winsome culturally and that connects. In all earnestness, God forbid that we would be distracted from actually trying to win people for Christ and instead defend the term evangelical. That would be a horrible misappropriation of our zeal. Nevertheless, the same book, Still Evangelical, one of the chapters talked about, wouldn't it be a very typical arrogant American thing to do, to take a worldwide term and unilaterally decommission it? Evangelical means something to people in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Asia, all parts of the world. And so we're part of a worldwide movement. And there's an honoring of that. It's not an easy term to replace. There isn't a one-word equivalent. And we also have to ask ourselves to what degree the people who hate evangelicals actually just hate historic Christianity. Mm-hmm. So if it is, I hate evangelicals because they stand for X, and the thought in your mind is, well, so do Catholics, so do Orthodox, so do have 99% of Christians across the centuries and the ages and the globe. Well, then it's not actually about the term. It's about the specificity of our way of life and our doctrine. So.
I would also say, I'd ask you all, my understanding is, looking at Lifeway data, is that evangelical for many has replaced Protestant. And so when we saw that 81% of white evangelicals reported voting for Trump, it wasn't people that necessarily went to church. They just self-identified. And I wonder how much of that is the word, in a sense. When it was smaller, we kind of knew what it meant to be evangelical. Now that more people have claimed it, and I actually think that is a positive aspect for those of us who are in the historical evangelical movement, is to use that as a way to witness and to say, well, here's what it really means to be an evangelical. I believe Jesus Christ died for my sins. I believe in Scripture. I believe it's so important that I'm telling you about this. And so I see this as an opportunity if the evangelical church is brave enough to offer a counter-narrative.
So something that was tough for the church in Jerusalem to accept was the fact that those Christians, those followers of the way, those followers of Jesus out there in these mixed race, mixed ethnicity, commerce, brought all kinds of people together in Asia Minor, that is where they were first called Christian, not the people in Jerusalem, in the center where they felt they owned the right to determine who was in, who was out, what was proper, what was not. And it was out there in those outlying areas, in the mixed places, where there was a clear identity. Okay, this is what it really means to follow, to recognize Jesus as the Christ, as the Messiah, and to live into that belonging. So I think more than an issue about words and how we package concepts, it's significantly about how we live and in what way we bring in an alternative that says the gospel has something to do with today's issues. The gospel has something to contribute to society at large, in all levels of it, because it is good news for today also. And so it's maybe more than debating the word, it's a matter of living into the calling and the identity and the belonging and the implications of the gospel in everyday life. And you mentioned the last point, these centers bring the world to Wheaton. Well, in what way are those Christians from those outlying places actually helping a nation that is at a crisis point, if you want to call it that, about their identity and belonging and priorities and values, and learn from the rest, and not just feel like this has to be the center that's going to determine everything for the rest of the world and impose their categories on the rest of the world.
That's fair.
It's great.
Oh, I couldn't tell if you were going to add something, Dr. McGraw. One more question, and then you get to join the conversation. Thinking generationally, one of the things that people often discuss is losing the next generation over negative associations with the word. At least in the United States, because I'm not sure if that would be the case where you were talking about, Ruth. So, but what about attending to rising generations that are at least confused about what evangelical means and wondering what is it costly, arguably, not just because it's a political identity, but perhaps because the things that they think it's being known for is actually being a hater, as opposed to being a person that loves people and looks out for the common good, et cetera. And so what about this generational question? Because certainly one of the arguments is, certainly in relationship to what happened with the 2016 election, is at least the perception of trade-offs being made, right? Like about character, for example,
Yes.
that really at least confuses, if not turns off, people generally, and they're like, I don't know what to think about this, or some are like, I'm done with this, right? So chances are there are students here at Wheaton College who feel that way, have that kind of confusion, and certainly there are people beyond Wheaton College who have that. what do we do to win them back, or to lessen their confusion?
I think one of the difficulties there is that there's no copyright on evangelical, right? We can't excommunicate anybody from evangelicalism. There's no, card carrying. There are no card carrying evangelicals because that just doesn't exist, and so there's no. It's very hard to kind of place the bad actors beyond the pale, as it were. And so for many people, and the 2008 General Social Survey, which is the kind of gold standard for survey work in the United States, was released today or yesterday. And it showed that 23% of Americans now will claim no religious affiliation, which is about the same percentage of Americans who would sort of be roughly, would claim affiliation as an evangelical of some sort. That's a huge increase in the last 15, 20 years. And, Bob Putnam and David Campbell in their book, American Grace, which is an excellent book, their view, and this has been, I think, borne out to some degree in later studies, is that some number of those people who will claim no religious affiliation, not no religious belief, but no religious affiliation, will claim that because of their distaste toward evangelical politics. That they feel like, oh, if that's what religion is, if that's what religion and politics is, if that's what Christianity is, I'm out. Now, most of them weren't really in anyway. They weren't much in at all. But it does create a barrier to the degree that there's a tight correlation in people's minds between the phrase evangelical and a certain kind of rather noxious politics. That means that people are less likely to hear the gospel. That's just a fact. And I don't really know what to do about that, to be honest with you, because you can't control the term. And people can claim, oh no, I'm in that camp, and here's what I think.
Yeah, and it's worse than that. So again, this is just analysis and not solution, because how the term operates in polling and in the media. So you can't be an evangelical in polling unless you're white. If you self-identify as any other race, you don't count as evangelical, because they think that your race is determinative of your politics, and they want to get at your politics, which gets at the other point, which is that the term only becomes operative on social, hot-button, and political issues. So you never hear in the media, all these people are building homes after this hurricane, and they are evangelicals. Their evangelical identity is not relevant in that context. It's only relevant on these social and political issues. So this guy who sent me the hate mail that I interacted with, again, he only thought evangelicals were white, because that's how the media works it. And I said, if you're in a decent-sized town or city, just drive, and you will come across a Chinese church, a Korean church, a Vietnamese church. You can go on and on and on, and they'll all be evangelical. But you're only seeing white, and then within that, you are only seeing those who are politically active, and again, like the way Dr. Bacote set this up, a particular kind of partisan, angry person. So if and the media incentivizes having the most extreme voices, because that makes for a more interesting segment in television or radio or whatever, and clickbait as well. So part of it, I did bring Holy Scripture, because for real evangelicals, we're going to quote Scripture sometime tonight. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders. We need a lot more evangelicals who are living like Paul says in 1 Corinthians, who people can look at and say, that's somebody that I admire. They're not a loudmouth provocateur. They're not always baiting people. They're not angry all the time. They're people of goodwill who are excellent in what they do, who work hard, and who are helping out.
Other thoughts about the generational question?
Yeah, I think younger people today more than ever are seeking authenticity They want to see that there is what they see on the outside is actually true in the inside, that it's not a veneer, it's not a facade. And so I'm with you. It's a matter of living into that which we say we believe. It's not about quoting, it's not about citing exclusively or about a set of ideas we can subscribe to. It's living into the relationship with the truth, who is Jesus Christ, and living it out in the way we interact with others, in our value systems, in our care for creation, in our care for neighbor, in our care for refugees, in the way we live, so that we live as Jesus did. And, you know, his call in Luke about his own ministry is so clear. And if evangelicals today could be identified as those who are really living into the good year of God's favor and freeing the oppressed and the blind can see, and even Naaman, the foreigner, is being welcomed, then maybe there wouldn't be such a crisis.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have 2 microphones right here.
Amen.
Thank you. So we invite questions. You get the first question.
Should I introduce or should we just, okay.
Yeah, Nick.
So I wrote this down. It's not that long, but I want to make sure I get it right.
Okay.
In my estimation, neither political party's platform is congruent with a distinctively evangelical Christian perspective in politics. Thus, should evangelicals withdraw from voting and participating in partisan politics in order to maintain a faithful, coherent witness? Or should they participate knowing that they will have to withdraw some core convictions in order to participate or vote fully for one political party? Thank you.
Thanks.
A great question. Can the organizational psychologist answer that?
Please.
I've been doing some consulting work over the years with a Christian union in Canada. In Canada, unions are organized, they're not necessarily organized by trades. So there is a Christian union in Canada, and they have to deal with this tension of a world redeemed, already not yet perfected. And so they're always making messy trade-offs. And in order to serve their union constituents, they can't withdraw. They have to be authentic and faithful witnesses, but they don't get to live, there's just messiness in the work they have to do. They have to work with, on both sides there's scallywags. And so I think as Christians we have to understand that we can't withdraw, and God doesn't want us to withdraw. I'll just say I have a son in the Army, and not really crazy. He's in the Army. He's in the 82nd Airborne, tip of the spear. We go to war. He's the first one in. It's not what I chose for him when he was born. But as a Christian man, I would want to know that my son and other men and women like him are the leaders of our armed forces. And for that, I applaud him, and I'm in awe of him. But he's in a messy place too. So that's the way I think about it. We have to be in these messy places.
I mean, political parties are, of course, coalitions, especially in the United States, where we have 2 sort of very broad kinds of parties. And it's very unlikely there's anybody who finds either of the parties entirely congenial. I think that there are times in which you do have to bail. There are times in which you think, okay, the party's going to go do that. I can't support that, or I can't support this particular candidate. And that may mean an end of a political career. It may mean the end of some sort of consulting career. It may mean the sort of the loss of influence. It may mean the sort of the loss of an election. But that's okay. We have to be willing to do that. But I don't think that means that you can't be a part of one of these parties and actually, even if the party as a whole has a conviction that you find abhorrent, you can nonetheless be a part of that party and elaborate that abhorrence. That's a terrible idea. You all have this sort of you're just wrong, dead wrong on this. I have a number of friends who are pro-life Democrats, and they are tearing their hair out at as one candidate after another for the nomination seems to kind of just have no concern at all for that issue, and they'll they will wrestle with that as they go ahead. But they're still Democrats. They just dissent on that particular issue, and for some of them that may mean they get to an election that they won't vote for a candidate, or they won't support that particular candidate. Yeah.
And if I may, I think, again, I think as Christians we have to expand our understanding and our practice of politics. Politics isn't just about elections that happen every 2 or 4 years or something. It has to do with the way we organize life and manage power at all levels of life. And if we were more intentional about living out the values of God's kingdom in those ways, I think those are schools. Churches can be schools for democracy in as much as we allow people to express different opinions and find consensus and negotiate. In my experience in a small local Anabaptist church in Argentina, it was a huge school for me to hear people presenting different opinions about things, listening to one another, dissenting, finding ways to negotiate an agreement. That's politics. It's not electoral politics, but it really is a school for us to become more responsible citizens at all levels. In our neighborhood, our intentional community we live in Costa Rica, we're dealing all the time with issues of politics and powers between the different neighborly associations and the municipality, and how funding is allocated to who and how. So if we learn to participate, I think that could give us a much more solid grounding for those other times that are few and far between.
Let me do one historical footnote on that. Christians and churches were much more in favor of votes for women than the population as a whole when that issue was debated. And part of the reason why was because women had been voting in Baptist and congregational churches for hundreds of years before that. It was a standard part of the church meeting. And so it was a polity of understanding that then could go to the wider society.
And I guess one thing I'd also add is, I think certainly it's a contextual question as well. If you are a Christian in a country like the United States, where it's a republic and as a citizen you have a certain level of ability to participate politically, it's very different than if you're a Christian in, say, Myanmar or North Korea. And so there's the question of what it means when you're in a context like this, where that is an actual possibility, because that's not an actual possibility for Christians in every society. And moreover, I think the question that we always have to ask when we think about stepping away from something that's messy is, okay, so are you going to do that all the way across the line in everything? Are you going to do that with all of your shopping? Are you going to do that with, okay, if you're into fitness, what clubs you're going to be a part of, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we have to do it that way, because it's easy to say politics is dirty and presume that everything else is, well, not quite so dirty without asking those questions. So I think we have to ask that question across the board and say, how am I thinking about being amid the mess and all of that, as well as asking, saying, I think, well, what is a proper Christian expectation if I don't believe it, if I don't have a realized eschatology, right? Where I believe that everything is supposed to be arrived now. If I don't have a realized eschatology, then what does it mean to live in a world without a realized eschatology and to live faithfully? Because that means it's going to be messy everywhere, basically. So, next question.
Thank you.
My question kind of was jumping off of that idea of identity within politics. I think that it's already been shown that a greater percentage of the 19% of evangelicals who didn't vote Republican in the last election are younger. And I think that young people are trying to live into this identity of not being defined by either party. I guess, could you speak to thoughts on that, thoughts of living between the party, and specifically about how that conversation relates to people, family members, friends, who might think that you're betraying something, you're betraying America. In that, can a person who ascribes to this more nuanced identity be patriotic?
Well, it's two very big different questions, right? I mean, one question is, again, how do you live? Well, one way of thinking about it is, how do you live in such a way that you hold your political, and I mean political here in a more narrow sense, identity relatively loosely, right? And one way I might think about that is I think about the term partisan. We tend to use the term partisan as to think about somebody who is wholly committed to one side or the other, right, or a sort of particular side. And indeed, historically, people have always been suspicious of parties and partisans. I mean, most of our campaign finance reform in the United States over the past 100 years has been designed to weaken parties. And it's succeeded magnificently, I think, in a terrible way, right? It's a terrible, it's really a very bad outcome. But the term partisan, in that sense, it recognizes that indeed you are a part, right? You have a particular view of what you want your society to look like, what you want your politics to look like, but you recognize you have a particular view. You are only a part, right? You are only part of this largely whole. And so I think there's a way in which we can sort of have this, even a kind of partisan political identity, even sort of have a sort of a view that, oh yeah, I'm part of one party or another, without sort of being dominated by that. I think that historically has been the case, where in any kind of party, there are a range of different kinds of peoples with different kinds of ideas. They really were rather broad coalitions. We've become much more sorted, maybe a little sordid as well. But I don't think that's still not out of reach for us. And so I think that sort of the key there is to sort of think about holding those kind of political commitments or those political identities kind of relatively loosely. And it doesn't mean they don't go away. The second question, well, this is the patriotic, yeah. We had a panel, I think, a few years ago, and I guess my guessing this is one place that Ruth and I are going to disagree, because I'd say you can. I mean, you're placed in a place, right, where our world is organized into countries. To the degree that patriotism means you at least sort of have a love for one's country and sort of seek its good. I don't think there's any sort of problem with that. That's different than kind of a chauvinism or even a kind of blood and soil nationalism that I think is indeed a problem. But those should be or can be rather different things. That would be my short answer on that. So.
I just want to say in the idea of patriotic, I was in Washington, D.C. last weekend, and struck by, with the political turmoil we have, how important the civil servants are. The day-to-day people who are working to keep our government on track. And my oldest son is a civil servant who works for the Navy. I think of both of my sons, one working for the Navy, one in the Army, and I am patriotic. And so Flag Day in June, the bunting goes up. I leave it up till August, and I cannot be more proud of my sons and by extension, those who serve this country. And that's what I want to think of as patriotism.
One thing I would add about the patriotism thing, I think a question that American Christians need to ask if they want to be patriotic is, what is their expectation for Christians in other countries, to think about their relationship to those countries? Because I often wonder if they basically want other Christians to just support the interests of the United States of America. In which case, then I think, is that patriotism, or is that really more of a nationalism type of situation? So I think that's always an important question to ask, because if you're a Christian, your ultimate allegiance is to Jesus, and you have family all around the world and across the ages. So what is that fidelity vis-a-vis properly attending to what your geography is and caring for that and seeking the common good for those within those borders. So I think nuancing that kind of thing is also an important question, because I just think a lot of American Christians just don't say a whole lot about what Christians in other countries should be thinking about their countries. We don't hear them encouraging patriotism elsewhere.
And another nuance to me that's important is who is us? Who is the patria? Who is when we say we are patriotic, who is we? When in your country you have such incredible sectors of society that are so excluded from any opportunity to participate. In racial minorities, ethnic minorities, native minorities, or majorities. I mean, so I think that's one of the other things that really has to be when in the imaginary of the nation, who is that? Who composes it? And in what way is everybody really a part? That's another pretty crucial issue.
Great, thank you. Since you're to my right, okay, you, then you, okay. Yes, to my left.
I find this very fascinating. This whole discussion is duplicating what linguists have talked about for decades, if not centuries, about prescriptivism versus descriptivism with language. Do we prescribe a definition, or do we describe how the word is being used? And I love your emphasis on we as Christians need to model what an evangelical is. Here then is my question. Would you have argued the same thing, say, in the 1950s for the word fundamentalist?
Is that a question for you, Tim? Since
Okay,
you're the historian?
I'll take it.
It's old.
It's beyond my lived history.
So we have a recurring pattern in history, which is that a word that once has a specific religious identity takes on just a generic pejorative tone. So Puritan became that for a long time. Puritan used to mean something very specific, and then it just became a way of describing something you didn't like. And that has happened with fundamentalist. So it meant something specific about a particular kind of Christian, and then it became generalized to any kind of group, any religion or other kind of environmentalist or whatever you are that we don't like, you're a fundamentalist. And that's now happening with evangelical, which is partly what there was an article in the Times Literary Supplement which talked about it was like the evangelical forces of ISIS. It was a phrase like that, yeah.
Wow.
And so it had become just this word, just a pejorative word about people I don't like. It wasn't meant to bring any kind of content about religious identity. I wrote an ironic letter in response, and it was too subtle for them, so they were just baffled. And so it's the same dilemma. You're left with that choice of, do I want to redeem this term and this community, or am I going to accept the fact that this word is so misunderstood that it's best not to use it? And that's what was called the neo-evangelical movement did with fundamentalism. And that's a choice we make, but I don't think we're there yet with evangelical. I mean, one of the things that we haven't said, which is just kind of quirky interesting, is one of the most progressive mainline denominations in America is the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. And they don't seem to have a big conversation about the fact that evangelical is in their name, so it's, there's many variances.
It's also, I think, interesting, and part of this goes to what Ruth said near the very beginning, which is there is a difference between the word evangelical and the word fundamentalist. Oh, yeah. Gospel is in the word evangelical. Yeah. Fundamentals means fundamentals of the faith, but the reason I think that it's got so much currency and gets attached to any kind of sense of, a pejorative that you associate with anybody who feels something really strongly and you think they're a zealot, is because it's not as easily connected to the specific beliefs. Whereas with evangelical, if you actually ask what the word means, you have to attend to what evangel means. So I think that is a distinction that's an important one.
Amusingly, I arrived at the mic with some very similar questions. I graduated from Wheaton 30 years ago with Tim. 30 years ago, fundamentalism was the term that we used for a certain sort of category of Christians. So my first question was, what happened? You've answered that. The next question is, what if evangelical went the way of fundamentalism as a term, as a descriptor? What would we lose?
That's a beautiful question.
I think this goes to Ruth's point earlier and to vis-a-vis fundamentalism. Fundamentalism was understood as an American phenomenon. Evangelical is a word that is worldwide. And I believe giving up the word evangelical means we do not stand with our brothers and sisters in Christ worldwide. So I'm willing to stay in the game.
Yeah.
Because for my brothers and sisters around the world.
That's helpful.
Good job.
Thank you.
Okay, since this was brought up, I love to debunk this. So there was a study by Lifeway Research, and in reality, just over half of evangelicals who voted did so for Trump. Still, nearly a third of evangelicals in both parties believe that a member of the party they disagree with, I'm talking about American political parties, can be a Christian. What do you have to say to those evangelicals?
To evangelicals that believe that if people are in another
Democrats
party,
or Republicans, they can't be
that
Christians.
the other party isn't really a Christian.
Yes.
And you can't really be a Christian and be part of the other party?
Correct.
Okay.
Well, I would like their children to apply to Wheaton College so that we can have a more expansive understanding of our brothers and sisters in Christ.
I mean, it is a sign that about the sort of the valorization of partisan political identities. That is, it's pretty destructive. I mean, I think there's some good research work to suggest that in general people are more worried about their children marrying someone of another party as opposed to of another faith, which is just nuts. I mean, honestly, just nuts.
That does show that, and many people have written about this, that people are treating political identities like religion, and like a cult, basically. So I think there's that dimension of that. Of course, what I always like to say is, how many people do you actually know in the other parties? Like when Tim has said many times, a lot of people that are critical about evangelicals have never met one. Other thoughts in response to that?
Now, just back to Mark Laberton's question. Still evangelical or
Yet
evangelical?
Which, yeah, that's great.
Is that
yeah.
part of the reason? If people's allegiances are so strongly politically partisan, where has the church been?
And I think it's fair to say as well, though, that and just this kind of pushes that is that part of the reason that evangelicals have a bad reputation to the degree that we do is precisely because the suspicion, particularly the suspicion is we have more of a commitment to our material comfort, to our racial identity, to our national identity, whatever those might be, that those things in fact do more to us and sort of shape us more than the creeds that we affirm on Sundays. Mm-hmm. And that's and that's probably a fair critique. Too often.
Next question.
One of the things that has piqued my interest in this conversation so far is the statement about part of the disdain about evangelicals may be really about Christians in general, disdain for Christians. And it makes me think of Paul's exhortation in Philippians 2, this idea of considering the interests of others and not just our own. And do you think part of reclaiming the term is us understanding what the hatred or the disdain about Christians in general is, in the United States and maybe around the world. Is there something for us? Do we need to take the interests of people who are disdainful about Christians? Like, maybe the question is, what do you see as the most salient reasons that people are disdainful about Christians? Mm-hmm. And is there something for us to reflect on, to take into consideration?
Yeah, I'm going to do, just again, maybe not the main thing, but a bit of analysis that I've been thinking about. It seems to me that we've had a significant erosion of cultural Christianity, Christendom, the kind of religiosity of the public space. And that's made a huge difference. So if you go back, whatever you go back, we'll say 30 years since we made that reference, even if you thought of yourself confidently as secular or non-religious or just, quite comfortable not buying it or thinking it was wrong, you had lots of experiences in your life of being in a room where somebody prayed. Mm-hmm. It happened at Boy Scouts, it happened at an assembly, it happened at your aunt's house, it happened at, and that's just like, I'm using that as just kind of a marker for a whole wider thing where there's a kind of level of, you understood what religion was, mm-hmm. even though you weren't religious. There was a level of comfortness about the reality of it as a sociological phenomenon. And I think religion is really inexplicable to lots of people today. That they have had zero exposure, and it becomes something that is foreign in a frightening and unbelievable way. What is that? How could that possibly be? And so there's an emotiveness that's different through the erosion of that common cultural space.
But is there not also on the other side, for those for whom Christendom was a comfortable place to inhabit, watching it crumble is so fear-inducing that you have to build higher walls and deeper trenches and affirm this is in, this is out in such a way that it actually, the encounter with people like that is even more of a detractor for people being interested, even if they do encounter somebody like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think Christendom has to fall.
Amen.
So Christendom to me is using worldly means to try to do spiritual ends, to kind of prop up the faith with force, with power, even if that's cultural capital. So I think it has to go, but when it goes, it's a shock. It's a big change. And so that is not without cost and disruption. But what you get afterwards is what you had in the beginning again, which is the people who identify as Christians, it means a lot to them. What you lose is cultural Christianity, a middle bit where that identity is being used for secular worldly reasons to get on in business or whatever. That goes away.
That makes, and I think I may have said something similar to this earlier, but it is interesting to observe the extent to which, even though evangelicals felt marginalized or withdrew from society, let's say, and let's say you go with 1929, there was still a certain presumptiveness about Christendom. Yeah. Even though there was a withdrawal, you weren't withdrawing, from something where there wasn't any, sort of resemblance of those influences. So, and now there is much less of that. So it's interesting.
So you all are working at a prominent evangelical college in America, and I'd imagine that from time to time you're approached by the press, being asked to, hey, give us the evangelical point of view on this or that thing that's going on in the world. Do you have kind of a response when people ask you to give the evangelical point of view, or do you just sort of humor them, or like?
No.
And can the rest of us take something from your kind of response to that?
It is part of the iconic brand of Wheaton College that does happen. I get asked to give the Protestant view a lot. I get, Washington Post, interviewed me and said, the Pope is coming to America. We have a Catholic view. Now give us the Protestant view. So, so yeah, I've done multiple stories like that.
Not worthy.
So my main goal is that they spell my name right. But yeah, no, I usually take them, but I try to do analysis and not pontification. I'm not saying here is what, again, the prescriptive, descriptive thing, that here's what all evangelicals believe or must believe. I tend to try to add understanding to the conversation, to do something that helps people come away better equipped to grapple with it than they were without it.
And particularly when I'll get questions about evangelical politics, part of my goal there is to help them see the pluralism within evangelicalism, right? I mean, because there's a kind of narrative about what counts as kind of evangelical politics, and the narrative isn't without merit, but it's a vast simplification, particularly given any particular kind of issue. And so, the goal there is to help, well, in some ways demystify, and to break apart these kind of monoliths. I don't know how well I do it. I think there's a very strong narrative that's out there, and that, we're just going to have to live with for a while, at least.
But now I'm going to speak as provost. I am so proud of the 222 faculty here at Wheaton College. They are incredible voices for the evangelical church, evangelical movement, and I want faculty to be speaking in analysis with their areas of expertise. And I'll put a plug, hashtag Wheaton Provost, because for the past year I've been tweeting out the good work of our faculty. And Tim always gets like 5,000 hits whenever I tweet something out of his, because I think it's important for us to be that voice, to cut through the counter narratives of what it means to be evangelical.
In addition to the gospel, what would your panel suggest are the distinguishing features of evangelicalism that maybe we should keep?
Well,
I would
Tim's
assume we'd keep El Evangelio, but the rest, what would we keep?
Dr. Larson,
Okay.
the Larson octal.
All right, so I will do that conversation as well. So for quite a few years, maybe it still goes on, there was a Wheaton Catholic exchange with undergraduates with Franciscan University in Steubenville. Some of them would come here and spend a few days on campus, and then some of our students would go and spend a few days on their campus as a kind of Catholic evangelical ecumenical exchange. So they had a panel like this, and the Catholic students asked me, who gets to decide the definition of evangelical? And I said, well, actually, I do. So so thank you for asking. So yeah, I did that in the Cambridge Companion to Evangelical Theology, and I do a version of my mentor, David Bebbington's, which is by far the most widely used, even by the media as well. So Bebbington said, crucicentrism, focus on the atoning work of Christ on the cross; biblicism, focus on the Bible; activism, focused on, which he means primarily the evangelism and missions, but also social justice work. So what have I missed? Conversionism, yeah. So thank you. Andy's here, and he's also did a PhD with David Bebbington with the fact that the gospel can transform your life in a conversion experience. My version added the work of the Holy Spirit, which I see as underlying conversionism and the activism that it's because we are prompted and led by the Spirit and equipped by the Spirit that we are active in the world, and that's how conversion comes about. So yeah, I think in the end, just sociologically, even despite the fact that this is the truth of the gospel, just sociologically, if we're not converting people, if we're not raising our children to be in the faith, if we're not discipling people to be mature Christians, then we're done as a movement. You don't continue if you're not doing that.
Would you add moralism to that?
What's good?
Moralism?
Moralism.
So, some sort of adherence to, is it pro-life? Is it not exactly supportive of maybe some LGBTQ issues, or those things seems to be attached to evangelicalism as well these days.
Yeah, in the popular American conversation. So I'm interested in a definition that works across centuries, across denominations, and across the globe. So I think that's what the Bennington definition is doing, and that's what I try to do in my definition. But I take your point that people import a lot of other things into the conversation in the American context, and that's part of what we're dealing with.
I think you do have to add, and I can't remember who said it, but part of the genius of the term evangelical is not all about unity, but also about all the plurality. And if you've got all that plurality, then you can't just presume that all these people are the same.
Yeah.
The fact is, as Tim once said to me, evangelical is a way of saying other people are Christians too, right? People who would never agree about the Lord's Supper, would never agree about baptism, would never agree about certain details of eschatology, but there are certain fundamental, in the right sense, or core, which as in foundational, term that they would use. So I think that's an important thing to think about the movement, because when people are doing the hot take, they presume that the plurality somehow just dissipates into nothingness. Yeah. But there's no evangelical term if you don't have the plurality to begin with. It's an intersection of all this plurality. Yeah.
So a place I find has been in more recent history, just back in 2010 with the work done with people, evangelical Christians from around the globe, in kind of bringing together the Cape Town Commitment. Mm-hmm. That's a call to the whole gospel, the whole church, the whole world, and just really, I think more than just tick the boxes on a few things, it's really the comprehensiveness of living into God's love for the whole of God's creation as God's people in the world, regardless of all our particularities.
Would you say the Cape Town Commitment is kind of like updating Lausanne? The Lausanne?
So the Lausanne Covenant of 1974 was still contested, particularly by the Global South, on some of its points, in its lack of integration and integrality. And so the Cape Town Commitment is definitely much more of a global expression of what I would say is a healthy evangelicalism in a broad sense of the term.
So I guess a healthy evangelicalism that is clearly about, if we go with the activism of evangelicalism, it's a much more expansive and deeper activism, in which case some of those distinctives then would be more engagement in the world than you thought there was. Is that a fair way to put that?
It is.
We have time for one final question.
Thank you. As part of the generation that's ruining everything in society, I wanted to go back to the discussion about the next generation. Because millennials are older than often perceived in culture, and we do have millennial faculty and pastors. And so I'm curious about those millennials that are already engaged in church leadership position in academia. Is there a difference in their perception about the term evangelical? And is it a term that's just going to die off with a generation, or is there a current movement within younger evangelicals to preserve the term?
What do you think?
I mean, just from my personal anecdotal experience, I would say that millennials are a bit less attached to the term, but I wouldn't generalize and say they all want to get rid of it.
I think that's the answer. Seriously, when we look at large scale, I'll let the political scientist.
I mean, to the degree that the term has been politicized and associated with sort of a certain style of conservative politics, and then to the degree that millennials tend to be less in favor of those kind of politics, then it seems reasonable to think they'll be less attached to the term. But as folks have said, there's both global utility to it, and there's not clear what the alternative is. I mean, indeed, to the degree that we have these kind of connections across denominations, across traditions, that are real connections and real kind of affections, real kind of like recognitions as fellow Christians, it seems like you need something to kind of say, well, what are we as well as just Christians, right? We're not Catholic, and we're not Orthodox. What exactly are we? You know, the only term at hand at the moment is evangelical. So, will they probably be as attached to it as say the boomers? Probably not. I don't know about Gen Xers. Nobody cares about us. And so probably not. But until something comes along that functions better, I don't think it'll necessarily go away. It may be used less as a kind of a marker for like you're in or you're out, right? Because we tend to sort of, I think oftentimes we use the term, at least within evangelicalism, to think about, oh, are you a serious Christian, right? I mean, it's sort of a cue to that. In some ways, that might get eroded. There might be more sort of a sense of like, well, you don't have to kind of be in there. Oddly enough, maybe because one of the, and I didn't mention this, and one of the kind of the, I think, positive things about evangelical politics the last 40 years is it's probably gone a long way to help reduce Protestant Catholic animus within the United States. I mean, it's the sort of hostility that I was teaching a Christian political thought class this semester, and we were reading Reinhold Niebuhr, and he takes some 2x4s to Catholics, and there's a kind of a real sort of deep suspicion there. I can't imagine a sort of serious work of Christian political theology that would have that kind of just sort of inborn sort of sort of worry about that, and part of that's evangelicalism. Even some Catholics want to call themselves
that's true.
that.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I'd like to give each of our panelists their opportunity to say something brief about just one thing you'd like to say before we conclude about a way forward with either the evangelical movement or the term itself. What is one thing you'd like to say?
I would like us all to not just be heightening rhetoric and posturing to people who think like us and being provocateurs and being hyperbolic in our speech. I would like us to speak in ways that are respectful and careful, and that is keeping in mind the humanity and presuming the goodwill of people who are different from us.
I grew up in going to camp in Lake Geneva, just across the border, sang with my tinny voice, "They'll know we are Christians by our love." I have my note here. We need to do good by doing well. We need to treat each other kindly. And that includes those who are our evangelical brothers and sisters in that authentic way. But we need to, the way we can be distinct is to be kind, because we live in a culture right now where that is very limited.
One of Jesus' parting words to his disciples was, "As the Father has sent me, so I send you." And so let's look back. How did the Father send Jesus? How did Jesus live? Who did he hang out with? Who did he listen to? Who did he chastise? How did he live? Where did he live? Let's just be just really follow Jesus and recognize that it is in the power of the Spirit, but our imagination is so captive by the ideals of consumer society and what it means to be in and to be, to be cool or whatever it is. But as the Father has sent me, so I send you.
In 1979, John Paul II, the communist government in Poland allowed him to come back home as a newly inaugurated pope, which was eventually, I think, kind of their undoing. And he had an open-air mass in Krakow where something like 10% of Poland's population showed up, which is pretty amazing. And his sermon, his homily, I guess is better, at that open air mass was centered around the words you see a lot in Scripture, which is "be not afraid." And I think that would be a word to kind of go by. I think much of what has gone wrong in evangelicalism over the last 34 years is rooted in a kind of a sense of, in some sense of unwarranted fears. There are real fears to have and worries, but I would suggest to be not afraid.
And since I'm the moderator, I get the last word. To all those great things, I would add that to be evangelicals, to really be people of gospel hope. And we're heading toward Easter, and if evangelicals really believe in a resurrected Savior, then no matter what real fears there are, we should be characterized by people who really believe that if God can overcome death, I think he can handle whatever waves there are in society, and that we ought to be people who exhibit that no matter what the slings and arrows may be. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at some of our events next year. As you see, we've already got a busy fall lined up. Take care.